welcome to Is This Lit? I'm Casey, and have I got a tale for you. Let me get personal with you. This is Oscar Wilde, my absolute favorite writer. Born October 16th, 1854, Oscar Wilde, or should I say Oscar Fingal O'Flaherty Wills Wilde, was an Irish author, poet, and playwright. Known for his biting wit, flamboyant dress, and glittering conversational skill, Wilde became one of the best-known personalities of his day and a commercially successful artist. As a dedicated spokesman for aestheticism, he published poetry and essays praising the movement, and lectured both in the UK and abroad. He also penned a single, impactful novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray. And that singular novel, and its relationship with the psychedelic horror game Layers of Fear, is what we will be honing in on today. The Picture of Dorian Gray actually exists in several different versions. There's the 1890 magazine edition, divided into 13 chapters, with important material removed before publication to censor it. The uncensored version, which was originally submitted to Lippincott's monthly magazine, also in 13 parts, and first published by Harvard University in 2011, and finally the 1893 book edition in 20 chapters. The Picture of Dorian Gray book format features an elegantly crafted preface, a defense of the rights of the artist and of art for art's sake. This preface was born out of the rigorous defensive campaign Wilde was forced to launch when his work was initially released in Lippincott's monthly magazine and was deemed immoral and corrupting. The craftsmanship, passion, and presentation of the preface has made it a famous literary and artistic manifesto in its own right. Now, why am I telling you all of this, you might be asking, and it's good to question. I'm telling you this because The Picture of Dorian Gray does not equal Layers of Fear, and vice versa. After playing through Layers of Fear, I researched around the web a bit, and I kept seeing statements like, Dorian Gray the game, heavily inspired by The Picture of Dorian Gray brought to life. It is not Dorian Gray. And simply calling it The Picture of Dorian Gray, the video game, does the game itself a disservice. Layers of Fear has wonderful storytelling in its own right. Published in 2016 by Bluebird Team for Linux, Microsoft Windows, PlayStation 4, and Xbox One, Layers of Fear is a psychedelic, psychological horror game where the player controls a severely disturbed painter who is desperately trying to complete his magnum opus. As you navigate around the painter's Victorian mansion, searching for 6 items necessary to complete the work, the house warps and contorts around you in an impossible maze. The gameplay is presented solely in first-person perspective and consists of puzzle solving and jump scares. There are no enemies to be had. But trust me, this game does not need enemies to be scary. As this game is entirely story-driven, it must have a pretty sick plot, right? No pun intended. Okay, pun totally intended. But yeah, it does, and let's look at that. From information pieced together while completing the game, we learned the following. The unnamed painter was an ambitious, talented, and it seems very successful artist. He fell in love with a talented musician, and the two were married. He used his beautiful pianist wife as a model for many of his paintings. Soon the couple were expecting their first child. The wife gave birth to a healthy daughter. But shortly after this, the painter decided to spend even more time locked up in his workshop, incessantly working on his paintings, and leaving his wife to raise the child all on her own. After buying a dog for the family, he starts to develop a serious drinking problem, which he blames on the constant noise outside his workshop. He muzzles the dog, but is soon completely obsessed with the notion that the home is infested by noisy hordes of rats, and attempts to have the house exterminated repeatedly. This is heavily implied to be a figment of the schizophrenia his wife believes he has developed. His talent and mental health starts to rapidly decay, and his artistic vision becomes twisted and very dark. He scares away friends and patrons by producing horrific, gory scenes for simple jobs, most notably a set of illustrations for Little Red Riding Hood. Desperate to break through to him, and after suffering a long period of neglect and emotional abuse, his wife decides to burn his paintings, including his most cherished work, The Lady in Black. In a drunken fit of rage, the artist apparently beats her, forcing her to leave with the young child. He tries to contact her several times in the period that follows, but the two fail to reconcile in any way. After some time, the painter finally receives a call informing him that his wife was critically injured in a terrible fire. She has become horribly disfigured, but their daughter wasn't harmed. After the fire, the painter takes his wife, who is now wheelchair-bound, and his daughter home to care for them. His drinking problems continue due to what he terms the distraction of their presence. Wow, what a nice guy. Once his wife regains the ability to walk on her own again, she is neglected even more because the painter deems her monstrous and lacking beauty. He cannot bear to look at her anymore. He seeks out numerous medical opinions and advice seeking to fix his wife, but alas, with the current Victorian medical technology, there is nothing more that can be done. Depressed, disfigured, and treated horribly by her mentally unstable husband, The wife commits suicide by slitting her wrist in the bathtub. His daughter is then taken away by social services. Flash forward to the present day, and we learn that once she was dead, the painter went completely insane and took 6 body parts from her to use in his painting. Her skin as canvas, her blood as the overlay, her bone marrow as the undercoating, her hair, which he made into a brush, her finger for smearing, and her eye to serve as a spectator. There are 3 different endings that the player can trigger depending on their actions throughout the course of the game. The neutral ending shows the artist working on a portrait of his wife as the masterpiece. He succeeds in creating the painting and steps back to admire it, only to watch it twist and deform into a mutilated figure that proceeds to taunt him before his very eyes. Horrified, he hurls the painting into a room full of completely identical paintings, all of which begin to laugh viciously at him. It's then revealed that the artist has been shut in the house for years working on the same painting over and over again, trying to perfect it. Every single portrait is well made and a perfect likeness of his wife, but he can only see a disfigured mess. The artist returns to the studio, unveils a blank canvas, and begins working on the next painting as the screen fades to black. The bad ending is initially similar. However, in this ending, he included his child in the painting too. The realization of the horrible mistakes he has made suddenly dawns on him in a moment of clarity, and the realization that he can never bring them back no matter what he tries. He walks upstairs and burns all of his previous paintings along with his most recent piece and seemingly perishes in the fire. The so-called good ending ends with the artist producing a portrait of himself as the masterpiece. Finally being satisfied, he hangs the painting upstairs. The next shot then shows his painting on display at a museum beside other famous Victorian artists. The story is dark, haunting, and draws a very visceral reaction. The story is not the plot of The Painting of Dorian Gray. This is going to be a very quick summary of a book that I highly recommend you read for yourself if you get the chance. But here goes. Title character Dorian Gray, a beautiful, narcissistic young man, is the subject of a full-length oil painting by celebrated artist Basil Hallward. Basil is a deeply immoral man, infatuated with Dorian's beauty as he perceives beauty as true goodness. Through Basil, Dorian meets Lord Henry Wotton, and that, my friends, is where everything goes to heck. Despite Basil's pleading with Henry not to talk to Dorian, Henry, of course, does just that. Lord Henry Wotton is a flippant, silver-tongued manipulator and espouses a philosophy of hedonism. Henry takes pleasure in influencing and misleading his acquaintances, but does not observe his own hedonistic philosophy himself. He prefers to twist and deform the morality of others and then study its effects with scientific detachment. He shows complete indifference to the consequences of his actions. The young and largely naive Dorian becomes completely enthralled with Henry and his hedonistic worldview, praising beauty and pleasure above all else. Suddenly faced with the realization that his own beauty will one day fade, Dorian yells out his desire to sell his soul, wishing that the portrait of him would age rather than he himself. This wish is granted. When he discovers this new arrangement, Dorian fully commits to a life of self-indulgent vice and sin. He stays young and beautiful while the portrait ages, and every horrible misdeed records itself in some way, disfiguring and warping his face. Dorian locks the portrait up so that its monstrous form won't be revealed and descends into a spiral of horrible behavior for 18 years. One night, his old friend Basil shows up at his house before leaving for Paris. Basil confronts him about terrible rumors of his excessive and destructive behavior, and Dorian does not deny his debauchery. On an impulse, he even takes Basil upstairs to see the portrait after all these years. The painting has become so disfigured and hideous that Basil can only identify it by his signature on the corner. Basil is horrified and believes it to be a reflection of the shape of Dorian's soul. He begs Dorian to make amends. Dorian cruelly and unjustly blames his fate on Basil and stabs the painter to death. Long story short, Dorian then blackmails another friend to help him dispose of the body. He eventually undergoes a slight moral crisis and tries to be good, but this is quickly revealed to be a complete facade because it is entirely due to selfish motivations and Dorian's obsession with collecting new experiences and sensations. He reverts back to classic scumbag Dorian and makes a fatal mistake. He slashes his portrait with a knife, the same knife he used to murder Basil Hallward, thinking that he can hide all the evidence of his sins and crimes. This immediately backfires, however, as it kills the real Dorian. The picture reverts back to its original beautiful self, and Dorian Gray lies dead on the ground, his age and corruption finally displayed in his physical form. Okay, now that we're all complete experts on both stories, let's revisit the fallacy of Dorian Gray the video game, shall we? Point number 1. While the narrative of Layers of Fear shares some themes with the painting of Dorian Gray, it doesn't share many. The ones I believe you could argue are the following: the obsession over beauty and what possesses beauty, moral corruption, and really the act of painting/painters. The strongest thematic similarity definitely comes from the concept of beauty. Both the unnamed painter in Layers of Fear and Basil, the painter from Dorian Gray, are preoccupied with the beauty of a human subject. For the unnamed painter, that subject being his wife, and for Basil, Dorian. When the subject's beauty is lost, they respond in emotional outbursts, horrified. The artist's wife is horribly disfigured, and it devastates him. While Dorian Gray's physical beauty never fades, Basil does set eyes on what has become of the portrait he lovingly painted of Dorian, and it has become monstrous and unrecognizable. The two men cannot handle the loss of beauty, the quality they both prize above all others. However, while Basil pursues beauty as the physical equivalent of goodness, the unnamed painter seems to pursue it for its own sake, with the sole purpose of crafting good paintings. Point number 2, moral corruption. This is where the two works really start to differentiate themselves. Dorian Gray and the painter are both morally corrupt. I don't think anyone would argue that. I mean, Dorian commits actual murder, and the painter drives his wife to suicide after years of complete neglect and then desecrates her body for use as painting supplies. Yeah, these guys suck. But let's look at the ever-important motivations. Dorian Gray does everything that he does throughout the novel because he is an extremely narcissistic, self-indulgent, and ultimately sociopathic individual constantly craving thrills and pleasures. He does as he pleases because he can, and doesn't care about any of the consequences of his actions, though he is aware of them. The painter is an entirely different case. Throughout the course of the game, it is repeatedly hammered home to the player that we are looking at a seriously mentally unstable man. It's even highly suggested that he is in fact schizophrenic. He experiences vivid hallucinations, attempts to self-medicate with excessive drinking, and in all but the bad ending, he seems entirely unaware of the consequences of his actions. In both other endings, he never comes to terms with his horrible mistakes and the fact that the loss of his family is entirely his fault. In the neutral ending, we see him painting the same piece over and over again, each time arriving at the exact same outcome, and then starting again. Repeatedly performing the same actions, but expecting a different outcome is the very definition of insanity. While it in no way excuses his horrific behavior, this man, this painter we are presented with, is mentally ill, severely mentally ill. This adds a whole new layer, so to speak, to Layers of Fear, that is not at all present in the painting of Dorian Gray: mental health. And our third point, paintings and painters and paint, oh my! The most obvious and actually weakest bit of evidence linking the two stories together, and the one I feel most people easily jump to, is, big surprise, both stories feature painters. However, the two painters could not be more dissimilar as characters. The unnamed painter is the protagonist and ultimately villain of his story, where Basil Hallward is a minor character within Dorian's larger narrative, and he serves as really the only example of virtue and civility. Beyond the fact that both men are devoted to beauty, and that's not really a tremendous surprise because they're both artists, literally the only other similarity between them is their profession. If the unnamed painter is meant to be a version of Basil, he completely misses the mark. Likewise, if the unnamed painter is meant to portray Dorian, again, it completely misses the mark. While he was many, many things, mentally unstable, Dorian Gray was not. He had complete agency and deliberately chose to be everything that he was. The painter operates as a shut-in, spurning all social contact. That doesn't check out. He has a wife and child. That doesn't check out. Dorian commits murder. Dorian sells his soul for a version of immortality. And finally, Dorian doesn't paint. The list can go on and on. So yeah, this is probably a bit long-winded, but it's a video that I really felt strongly compelled to make. I love both the painting of Dorian Gray and Layers of Fear, and to call either just a rip-off of the other does a disservice to them both. Layers of Fear brings a lot to the table. It offers a gripping story, some very inventive gameplay, and the game is visually stunning. I highly recommend checking it out if you're one for horror games. So the burning question, is Layers of Fear lit? You better believe it, but once and for all, it is not the same lit as the painting of Dorian Gray. Hope you enjoyed the episode. As always, it's been lit, fam.